So this is what's happened to Zimbabwe. We have a disabled country, disabled by policies that were put in place on purpose. And when you bring these up today, and I've done this recently with senior people in government, and say to them, you have policies that you deliberately chose that disable the country, we've got to change those policies. They tell me those policies are sacrosanct, we will never change them.
Welcome back to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have my guest, Mr. John Robertson. He's the Managing Director of Economics at RobertsonEconomics.com. Mr. Robertson is a Zimbabwean resident that has been very active in speaking out against the economic crisis in his country of Zimbabwe. John has been featured on various news channels as well as writes commentary for a variety of news sources in his home country of Zimbabwe. Today he joins us to give us a closer look into the horrific economic conditions he's facing in his country as of right now today. So John Robertson, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate you sitting down with me. As I mentioned before, we've had some back and forth trying to nail down a solid time, being that you're in the midst of some things where you're, I guess, hunting for cash or whatnot for your situation there. But before we get into any RTD questions, give the audience a chance to find out who John Robertson is. What's some more of your background that I may have missed in that introduction?
Right. During the 1970s, I was a financial journalist. I became financial editor on the Herald newspaper here in Harare. Then it was called Salisbury in Rhodesia. At the end of the 70s, I joined a merchant bank, and I worked with them for 16 years. And by then I had reached retirement age. I did have a previous career that involved me in technical things. I used to work for a radio manufacturing company in Bulawayo, and I had originally done an apprenticeship as a radio technician. So moving into economics was a later stage in my life, and I've been in that ever since 1967. So I've now retired, and I formed my consultancy on retirement, so I've been running that now for 21 years. And I've been writing on the situation for the business sector, carrying forward a lot of the clients I had with the bank, describing the budgets and the different conditions that are affecting business, affecting investment, and affecting things like the exchange rate. We used to have a fairly respectable currency, well supported by a very respectable economy, very diverse economy, big manufacturing sector, a big mining sector, a very powerful agricultural sector, and a very good balance of trade figure. We used to export a very wide variety of goods, and we had very little need for imports because it was such a self-sufficient country.
Right.
We had a good infrastructure, good power, good transport, and all of these things were still functioning when independence came in 1980. But unfortunately, government began to work on a redistribution policy, redistributing the assets of the country to people favored by the political party that it represented. And from the worst of these events, which was the land reform program, which started in 1997, so nearly 20 years since that started.
Yeah.
And it caused the redistribution of the prime agricultural land to people who would no longer have to pay for land. In fact, the government claimed that they were the owners of all the land in the country, and therefore it could be given to people. But of course, as soon as land ceased to have a market value, it ceased to have collateral value. And so the people could no longer borrow against title deeds. And suddenly the agricultural sector became very nearly bankrupt. The farmers who took up that land under the land reform program could not find the money needed to do any reasonable farming. And ever since then, we've been importing food.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of our manufacturers had depended on agriculture, and so a lot of our manufacturers also closed down soon after that.
Right. Now, before we get any deeper into the actually ongoing currency crunch or currency crisis there, I typically start off RTD with some RTD interview questions. for most part surrounding the dollar, but yet being that you guys have the Zimbabwean dollar there, I think you can kind of share your viewpoint from a Zimbabwe dollar standpoint. And so what comes to mind when John Robertson hears the words rethinking the dollar?
Well, we adopted the US dollar when we destroyed the Zimbabwe dollar. And we destroyed that by simply printing money to make up for the loss of tax revenues when the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector virtually died under the effect of the land reform program, causing the destruction of agricultural output and the destruction of a lot of our manufacturing output. Government lost the source of its principal tax revenues when industry and agriculture suffered so badly, and that meant that they had to print money to make up for the loss of tax revenues. And the printing of money caused what became a very, very high rate of inflation, and then hyperinflation. We were moving from thousands of percent inflation to millions of percent inflation. The highest figure that they recorded was 231 million percent inflation, and that was during 2008. It carried on getting worse after that, but they were no longer trying to record it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the very end, we were printing $100 trillion notes.
Yeah.
And with $100 trillion, you could buy a couple of loaves of bread. And when that happened, they suddenly decided we should abandon this currency and start using US dollars. We didn't need the permission of the American government to do that because the US dollar is an international reserve currency. And of course, we were exporting things and being paid US dollars for gold, for platinum, for tea, for coffee, for cotton, and all the principal exports that we had.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with those things happening, it led to, a reasonably good inflow of US dollars at the beginning. And then we saw another measure by government to help to redistribute wealth, and they called this the indigenization policy. And this came out in 2010. And when that happened, the money supply growth in the country died away because investors stopped coming. And the companies that were here already were told, you have to share the equity of your company with so-called indigenous Zimbabweans. So if you had foreign origins of any kind in the country, you had to give away half your company to people who were not expected to pay for the shares. And in the mining sector, the government said, because all these companies are mining minerals that belong to the state should consider itself automatically a 51% shareholder in every mine yet to start. And they would not pay for those shares because the minerals under the ground were their contribution to the equity of the mining company. Well, a lot of these ideas were absolutely nonsensical, and they led to a very steep decline in investment interest, a very rapid outflow of the money that could be moved. And of course, now that we were using US dollars, the Reserve Bank in Zimbabwe couldn't impose exchange controls in a way that would prevent the US dollars from moving to another country.
Mm-hmm.
And so we drained the whole economy of US dollars. And that's the consequence we're experiencing now.
Yeah.
People have money in the bank, they have numbers against their ledgers in the bank accounts, but there's no US dollars in the country to actually match the balances, billions of dollars worth of personal and company bank accounts.
So let me interrupt for a second. So currently in the bank, there's actually, as you mentioned, ledgers of, there's digits saying that there is, say, 1,000 US dollars in bank accounts, or is that 1,000 Zimbabwe, or what actual denomination of currency is that in? Is it dollars?
This is the really confusing issue. They call it an RTGS balance. That stands for real-time gross settlement. And this is the language spoken by bankers when there's an interchange of balances from one ledger sheet to another, or one bank account to another. But at one time it was actually represented by US dollars that did exist in the system as US dollars, because the entire bank balances were deposits of US dollars, and that's what was being built up while the investors felt safe enough to leave the money in the banks. But another major pressure here was we were importing far more than we could physically pay for, and our import bill was something like double the revenue we were getting for our exports. And so the drainage of US dollars from the system were from these two sources. One, people moving their money because they wanted to send it somewhere where it might be safer. And secondly, money moving out of the country to pay for imported goods, most of which we used to produce ourselves, but we can no longer produce because the company's closed down. So now, while we have still $4 or $5 billion in the bank accounts, we have maybe $200 million in physical notes in the country. And that's what the government has been trying to supplement by now printing a new variety of something which they are carefully avoiding calling a new Zimbabwe dollar. They've given it a name, bond notes, which makes no sense at all. But it is in fact a new currency. They've declared that it is legal tender. They have demanded that the population take it seriously and respect its value. The value they've given it is $1 equals one bond note, and one US dollar, that is. So we are supposed to believe that that value will be retained. And now the great fear, starting this very week, is that the flow of these notes into the market is going to cause a rapid deterioration of this value of all the money in the RTGS accounts. And the only money that will retain its value will be physical US dollar notes. And anything else you might have, you may have to trade at a discount. You might be expected to pay more of them to get what you want. And some people are saying, well, if you buy the goods from us with physical US dollar notes, it's going to be cheaper than if you make a transfer from your bank account to our bank account to pay for them.
Right. Now, earlier you hinted on the idea that, throughout the entire Zimbabwe crisis, you threw out some figures that are, beyond actual comprehension for us Westerners that have no concept of a high inflation rate or hyperinflation. Can you walk us through the day-to-day of living in a hyperinflation type situation where, what you're using to exchange, your medium of exchange is no longer really wanted by anybody? Give us paint a picture for us of what that looks like and feels like.
Well, it was a long, agonizing experience. It lasted several years. But in the original period, it meant that the notes were getting bigger and bigger. And so we were soon working with $1 million notes to buy basic groceries. Then they became $1 billion notes. And after a while, the Reserve Bank said, well, we're going to remove zeros from this so that they get back to more reasonable sizes. And over the period through that whole exercise, we ended up removing 25 zeros from the notes. And while that process was happening, of course, the physical quantity of notes became so big that people were paying with bundles of notes that were sometimes weighing in at kilograms, several pounds of notes that you would hand over at the cash register at the supermarket. And because they didn't have time to count them, they would weigh them. Wow. And they would assume that they were all the same value, billions of dollars per each note. And that many pounds of those would come out at the right figure to pay the bill. Because this was very difficult, and they then came out with yet bigger notes or more zero removals, so that the notes then became more reasonably easy to handle.
Right. Was there any concern during that time of having to weigh bundles of cash to actually purchase things? Was there ever concern of counterfeiting, being that the paper just would flow plentifully? That was somebody at home probably running up these fake paper notes and trying to flood it even more? You think so, or what?
Well, the notes values were falling so rapidly. If you can add up the prices of the Kona toner cartridges you need for your color printer that you would tie to your computer, you would never be able to recover the cost of the toner cartridges to print the notes.
So the
And
ink
of
was
course,
more.
it was on rather fancy paper, which we couldn't easily duplicate. So the counterfeiting never arose. It was never worth the effort. And the notes were of so little value that individual notes, you could see them lying in the streets, and people wouldn't even bother picking them up. They were so valueless. So no, that wasn't a problem.
Wow.
We had every other problem you can think of, but not that one. So it became very cumbersome, very difficult. And the most difficult thing was that by the time you had spent the wages you had earned for the previous month, you needed 2 or 3 times as much as you were able to earn in a month to live through the next.
So John, so as of now today, you hinted at the fact that most people are scrambling for cash currently in the form of these new bond notes. And so I guess I saw something that I guess they printed up. I think it was initially 12 million, if I'm not mistaken, worth of bond notes to distribute amongst the people, or is that figure wrong?
Well, it's a complicated issue, mainly because people don't believe what the government is telling them. What the government is saying to us is they're going to only print $200 million worth of bond notes, and they're going to be released into the market at the rate of 10 million a month.
10 million a month, okay.
Now that's less than $1 per person per month, which is not enough to make a difference. But the fact that it is a destabilizing concept, an idea that is distrusted, while it is not going to help overcome the problem, it has done enormous damage to the confidence of ordinary citizens who feel that this is the thin edge of the wedge, and we will soon see billions of these dollars floating into the system, and therefore every prospect of seeing their value disappear and sort of crash within literally days.
Right.
Now we've got some important events in the near future. We've got the budget on Thursday this week, and we've got the ZANU-PF conference. The ruling party is having their party conference in 2 weeks' time, and the fear is among them that the bond note value will already be trading at maybe 1/10 of its value, and they will have a hard time retaining any credibility amongst the population if that happens.
Yeah.
And so they're making some fairly aggressive noises to persuade people to take this seriously and not undermine it by suggesting things that could cause it to depreciate more rapidly or to lose the respect of the population.
Right.
So we wait for a couple of events in the very near future to see how politically this is going to succeed.
Right.
Economically, it cannot succeed because it's not dealing with the economic problems which relate to production, investment, confidence, investor confidence in particular. All of those are still missing, and nothing that has happened so far has made the slightest difference to any of those problems.
Right. Now, currently, I guess, are those bond notes, they're supposed to be backed by the U.S. Federal Reserve notes, and so what's the current, reserve status as far as the savings for, or from what you know of, that the actual Bank of Zimbabwe have in reserves to kind of back up these notes?
They claim to have borrowed money from the Africa Import-Export Bank, and the phrasing is always difficult to interpret because they don't say we have a loan of that much money which is supporting the currency. They say we have a facility which sounds like it is a backup or an underwriting facility rather than a loan. But they say it is backed, therefore, by money in the Africa Import-Export Bank, and therefore it is backed by US dollars, and therefore it should retain its value. But the great fear is, of course, that they are going to print considerably more than the 200 million. And the fear of that is because everybody realizes that printing only 10 million a month is not enough to fix the problem. So if they do want to actually fix the problem, we need a far greater volume of actual physical money, and we need money that we can trust.
Right.
And this appears to be an effort which is not trusted from the very beginning, and therefore an effort which is going to lead to further discrediting the government and further instability in the market.
Right. Now, for those, a lot of my listeners, as well as myself, I've never had a chance to actually visit Zimbabwe, so not familiar with what just the standard of living, the cost of living is. Now, so give us an idea into the actual economy for the lower class, middle class, worker there. What's the minimum wage type of figures, and what would lower class, middle class, upper class family possibly make per month? Give us a couple of details into just the standard of living in Zimbabwe.
All right. So the minimum wage is of the order of $250 a month. Now that might not sound very much, but it is actually quite high for a country with a very low level of productivity. In other words, you don't have to do very much to earn that amount of money. And what you do, people are finding that they do it so poorly with such outdated equipment or with so little investment backup, so little capital backup in the businesses, that it is too expensive to employ people at that price or at that wage, because you can import goods more cheaply than you can make them here if you're paying that wage to people who are not very productive, not producing very much per day. Now, of course, productivity is very much the side of the employer. If they have outdated machinery, then it's their fault. People can't be very productive on the obsolete machinery. But the investor confidence is missing, and that's why the machinery is so dated and so inefficient. So it's a mixture of different problems. But the bigger issue here is that the number of people who have a job in Zimbabwe is very small indeed. The unemployment is more than 80%, more than 80%. In other words, only about 20% of the people who want a job can find a job. And the number of people who are employed in this country today in the formal sector, that's getting a regular income every month, that number is back to where it was when the population of this country was 1/3 the size it is today. So we still have very high population growth in many countries in Africa. Zimbabwe is one of the highest. And if you go back to the 1960s, when the population was 1/3 of its current rate, we had as many people in a job as we have today. So that means that there's an enormous number of people living in this rather parallel universe here, the so-called informal sector, people eking out a living, not by working, but by scavenging, or by vending vegetables on the sides of the streets, or by driving illegal taxis, hoping they won't get caught, or by doing quite a lot of other illegal things, cross-border trading without going through the customs posts, doing various things that allow them to earn a few dollars a day to keep their families going, but the dollars they're earning is not enough for families to lead reasonable lives. It's very hard to pay school fees when all you're earning is a couple of dollars a day for your family. The families still tend to be fairly big, around about 5 children per family is the average. And so many of the families are living at a very, very poor level because the money they have available to them is so small and the job opportunities are so rare that very few of them can actually aspire to anything like their potential. And that has led to yet another of the problems, which is that the best skilled people with skills that they can sell have left the country. Many of them are sending money back to their families, and that's actually sustaining a great many people. The so-called diaspora from Zimbabwe, great many, maybe several million people live in South Africa. They're sending money back to Zimbabwe, and between them, they are certainly keeping some millions of Zimbabweans alive. And that's with money that is earned somewhere else. Where that money is earned, the taxes are paid in those countries, not this one. And where the jobs are being created are in other countries, not this one. And so, of course, all of these are working against the interests of Zimbabwe, even though these factors are helping to explain why Zimbabweans are not starving to death. The informal sector is very big, much bigger now than the formal sector. But the informal sector, one of its definitions is it's not in the tax net, and therefore is very difficult to tax and doesn't pay tax. And for that reason, its contribution to the whole economy is, barely more than sustaining the lives of people without contributing to the welfare of the country.
Yeah. Now let's turn the page a little bit and get into the leadership of your country, the government there, and the people's confidence and interaction with the government. Now, your president, Robert Mugabe, he's the current president. What's the thoughts around what's the thoughts amongst the community in regards to their leadership? Because I'm a firm believer that all these crises we're seeing globally, whether it be in Venezuela or India, all kind of starts from the top, which is our leadership. They're the ones that kind of are implementing these policies, sort of say, as well as the central banks that impact the people the most. What's the thoughts there about Robert Mugabe? Is he a good leader, or what are your thoughts?
This is a sociological question, and quite a lot of the answer would be in the psychological territory. The people believe in respecting the leadership at any cost.
Yeah.
The leadership deserves respect, even if it is performing badly. And while it is the leader, then you do not attack them, and you do not try to cause any kind of, well, here the phrase regime change is treated as a treasonous concept. In America, you've just gone through an election. The very thought of an election that might dispossess the leadership of their powers here is treated almost as a treasonous exercise. And so there are claims that the last 3 elections were not won by Robert Mugabe's party, but he's still in power because he simply has refused to stand down despite losing those elections. So there's concepts here that will be very strange to the Western thinking, where if you simply lose a vote of confidence in Parliament, you stand down. Here, even a complete election can be held, and the declaration at the end of it is that the ruling party has won again and they're still in power, even though all the evidence is that the other party won the election. So we have a very strange concept here. The president gets enormous respect from a very high percentage of the population, which means that he's still entrenched, he's still there, he's very elderly, he's not well, he's certainly not strong, and there's 100 reasons why he should retire, but they can think of 1,000 reasons why he shouldn't, and should even contest the election we're planning to hold in 2018. Now, that's the sort of thing that's going to be discussed at the party congress within the next 2 weeks. And, well, maybe we'll be surprised by a decision made that President Mugabe should take retirement. But the present thinking is that he wants to actually die in office. And he is determined to still be in office on the day he dies. Now, under those conditions, we can see that it's going to take some time to bring about any of the policy changes that are needed. And the policy changes come from the decisions made by Robert Mugabe to indulge in the various redistribution measures taken. Wealth redistribution was a driving force. And of course, we have a long colonial history, and he has many very emotional things to talk about in terms of the history of the country. And prefers to leave out of the equation all the great advantages that were brought to this part of the world by the manner in which the colonial experience impacted upon the people here. This was probably the most developed country in Africa, apart from South Africa. And the amount of development that happened here far exceeded the development that happened almost everywhere else in Africa. And it even exceeded the amount of development that happened in many South American countries. So as a developing country, that old country, Rhodesia, was one of the most developed countries in the developing country world. All of those advantages are simply rejected completely by the politicians, who say that the very idea that colonizers should come in and occupy a country way back in 1890 was so terrible that it doesn't matter what advantages they brought with them, they should be completely discounted. And we should make the bring the policies in that would restore the policies that were in place before the country was colonized. Now, that can be briefly stated as a feudal society. It was a feudal kingdom back in those days where the feudal leaders actually claimed ownership of everything, much as the feudal leaders did in Europe 1,000 years ago. And that was the case here. And they have been trying to restore that sort of relationship with the leadership now, saying that they have such complete ownership of everything that they alone should be allowed to say who should get control of whatever advantage, whatever assets, whatever physical structures might be on offer. And so therefore, that's been the policy. We, the government, decide that those people there should have these assets. And so we're going to take them from the people who have them now and give them to the people that we have chosen to favor. Now, all of that has led to the psychological effects of people saying, well, if we're going to get it for nothing, we don't have to look after it. And if it breaks down, we can get another one for nothing next week. And well, productivity has collapsed. The initiative that should be taken by people has also collapsed because, strangely enough, what's been given to you for nothing can be taken away from you for nothing. And even if you're an indigenous Zimbabwean, many of them have found that they were suddenly the beneficiaries of a redistribution of wealth in this way. And then suddenly they were dispossessed again because somebody more important decided that they wanted it, or they in some way upset the equilibrium in the party and needed, according to the party, needed to be punished. So they could have assets stripped from them. And so there was no security of tenure. There was no confidence amongst the potential investors. And the people who might have invested were completely demoralized, and the incentives that might have driven them to do better things were simply taken away. In other words, the more you succeed, the more you're likely to be stripped of your assets. And there's nothing more demoralizing than that possibility.
Right.
And just the possibility of that discourages people from even making the first effort to get things right.
Right.
Now, so it's a very complex issue, and it's all sociological and psychological rather than economic.
Right. Now, as we draw towards the end of our conversation, I want to get your thoughts. Being that you're an economist, I'm assuming you you pay close attention to world events. And so, what are some parallels or some similarities between the situation in Zimbabwe with that of, say, Venezuela, and the currency situation in India now? I know Nigeria is having problems. The South African rand is not doing all that well. All these fiat currencies, they are struggling. What's some similarities with and why is that taking place now?
Right. The strongest comparison there is with Venezuela, and their problem started with their decisions to nationalize all the oil wells, all the oil-producing companies that have been set up with international investment capital. And when the government of Venezuela simply said, these are now the property of the state, they destroyed the investor confidence that might have continued to develop other facets of the Venezuelan economy. And it caused the inflation, which is what they're now struggling with. They're going through very, very similar experiences to Zimbabwe, but it was the productive capacity that was undermined by a policy that said we can nationalize and therefore confiscate assets from other people. The comparisons with India are a bit more complex. In this country, some of the people who were most eagerly seeking the benefits of the patronage that came from government would translate that into large sums of money in, of course, large denomination banknotes. There's no point in having suitcases full of $1 notes if you could have suitcases full of $100 notes. And that was the comparison made in India, where the people who had been able to manipulate and take advantage of various weaknesses in the structure could say, well, these very large denomination notes are the benefits of our activities, and so that's what we've got to capture. And the government could easily target them by simply saying, we have decided that these notes are no longer legal tender and will not be accepted by anybody, and we can virtually dispossess the people who have acquired outrageously large sums of money by declaring that money to be no longer acceptable. But that was a much more targeted and narrowly defined exercise in India. It didn't affect the entire economy, and the ordinary people in India are still working for the moderately valued notes and still working just as hard and probably just as effectively as they did before. It's only the ones who had made these outrageous fortunes who were suddenly dispossessed.
Yeah.
Nigeria, another complication there, and I would argue that the issue in common there is property rights again. It's very hard in Nigeria to become an owner of property. For that reason, the companies that settled in Nigeria had difficulty retaining ownership of and control over their investments in the oil businesses. And with the governments behaving the way they did and demanding the revenue from them that they did, there was very little new investment. And there was an absolute calamity that's been going on for years in Nigeria, affecting pollution. And you had in America the terrible experience of the oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, the ocean around Nigeria has been as polluted as the Gulf of Mexico was during that crisis. The area around Nigeria has been that polluted for generations because of the very low level of investment in the infrastructure that would have been enough if those companies had been allowed to retain ownership or gain ownership of the oil wells and invest in them properly.
Yeah.
And if they had done that, they would have built oil refineries in Nigeria. It's crazy to think that Nigeria, as an oil-producing country, is still importing refined gasoline, refined dieseline, because they don't know or don't have the facilities to refine enough of it in Nigeria themselves.
Yeah.
But that takes a lot of investment. Investment calls for investor confidence. Investor confidence calls for security of ownership of the assets that you have to build to make the refining and the other things possible. And if you take away any one of these components in this jigsaw puzzle, then the whole thing just can't be completed. So that's what they've done in Nigeria. And if they were to introduce and properly bolster up property rights in Nigeria, Nigeria would become a very wealthy country.
Yeah.
And I'd argue the same for Zimbabwe. What we lack is the property rights that we once had here, which had made the country more successful than any other African country north of the Limpopo. And we took that away. And now we are one of the poorest countries in Africa. Everybody else has bypassed us. And we are now rated amongst the worst cases in the whole world for corruption, for the ease of doing business, and for the attractiveness that the country presents to foreign investors.
Wow. Now, as what I've taken away from those different comparisons of those countries, you start off by saying, the government implemented, the government this, the land rights. I mean, everything's kind of started from the government. Now, as we draw towards the end, we talked about the problems, and it seems like, it's government intervention and a lot of what was supposed to be more free market, capitalism type of environments is no longer that case. And so what are some solutions? I mean, I know here in America, in the alternative media world, we're big encouragers of alternatives, like just not depending solely upon your government for anything other than learning how to fend for yourself. And that means even with your energy, with your storage of your capital in the form of precious metals and cryptocurrencies. There's many alternatives towards saving and preserving some of your wealth. What's the feel like there in Zimbabwe, being that you guys are rich in minerals and all of the elements of the earth is rich in Zimbabwe? Is sound money, precious metal, something that is looked at as alternatives of there, or what are your thoughts with that? What's it like on the ground there?
Well, your question is a very complicated one, but let me get to the essence of the big difference here, which is when countries treat their citizens as the people who are running the country, and the government is in those countries to serve the people, if the government is there to facilitate investment conditions, to create conditions that are conducive to more investment, you can argue there that the government's accept that their responsibility is to serve the public. And they call themselves public servants. And we have a civil service, yeah, they are the servants of the people. In the countries which have gone in the other direction, the governments treat the people as being there to serve them, the government. So who's there to serve who? If the government believes that the people are there to serve the government, serve the leadership, you're back to that feudal structure. You can equate that to the situation in the days of Chinese emperors and the pharaohs of Egypt and the Caesars of Rome. The people were there to serve the leadership and make them very rich and very comfortable. And that sort of condition does not need to change. When the leadership is very comfortable, it does not want to see change. And if somebody looks like they might be trying to change something, usually in those feudal societies, they have their heads chopped off because they might become a threat. Now, in a society where the government sees its job to be there to serve the people become very innovative, they become very adventurous, they become inventive, and they have the courage to follow their ideas to build better and better businesses, better products, better markets, better lives. And they don't feel threatened by their government because they are becoming wealthy or influential, or in some way they're changing the course of history because they're being permitted to use their imaginations and take the initiative to bring about change. So those are the countries that have made progress. Those are the conditions that have caused the progress in the United States for the last couple of 100 years. And hopefully that will continue. And I think that, the leadership that's on the way in the United States may well see its function to be to support the people who have the courage to take initiative and build bigger and better businesses. And that, of course, is of advantage to all the people in the country who either work for those businesses or can take home a decent salary and bring up their children properly, and the businesses themselves generate tax revenues that keep the governments going. So these are philosophical questions, really. Which way does your government actually want to function? And we have here in Zimbabwe a government that says we are here to be served by the people. And if we find that you are trying to serve yourselves instead of the government, we might just go for you. And that is what they did to the commercial farmers, because the commercial farmers were a very influential group of people. And there were many indigenous commercial farmers as well, who were also dispossessed of their land when the land reform program happened. So it was not only white farmers that were dispossessed. There were many black farmers who were dispossessed as well. And so many of the stories propagated by government were actually not truthful. The government was trying to reduce the influence of a powerful industry, and they perceived the power of that industry came from the property rights that the people had over the land. And how do you weaken a powerful structure? Well, a good way to start is to take away their property rights.
Right.
So they cancelled the property rights of the commercial farmers, and they were immediately turned into a completely irrelevant body of people who could not influence developments from there. But of course, the government didn't have the means to stop the market from reacting. What most governments in the world do not appreciate readily is that whatever political powers they've got, their powers will never match the power of the marketplace. And the market in this country brought the country down. As soon as you can no longer produce the goods that you need, the prices rise, and the scarcities become so serious that you cause social and even security disruptions that begin to undermine the stability of the entire country. So this is what's happened to Zimbabwe. We have a disabled country, disabled by policies that were put in place on purpose. And when you bring these up today, and I've done this recently with senior people in government, and say to them, you have policies that you deliberately chose that disable the country. We've got to change those policies. They tell me those policies are sacrosanct. We will never change them. And I've pointed out that if we don't change the policies that have done the damage is not going to be repaired.
Right.
And only by repairing this damage can we get back onto an even keel and back to a growth and back to deserving the respect of other nations. Right now, we deserve nobody's respect. And this is what the government is now discovering.
Right.
Just another aspect of the money side here, we ought to be able to go to the international bodies like the World Bank and the IMF and seek assistance. And they've said to us, well, we're not going to give you any assistance while you retain the policies that did the damage. In other words, they've said, we want you to adopt a reform program, and they've actually listed the reforms they want to see us undertake. And when we undertake them, when we even start to undertake them, they will reconsider their current objections to lending us money. But we haven't started.
Right.
We promised a year ago at the IMF meetings in Lima, South America last year, that we would start on a reform agenda, but we haven't actually started even now, a year later. And so we're attracting no assistance from the World Bank or the IMF or the African Development Bank or the European Development Bank. And even the Chinese, who are considered our best friends, have said, we're very impatient with you guys because you never keep your promises and you have not introduced the reforms that you promised.
Right.
So,
wow, that sounds like a nice long journey and process that is, still underway. So we'll see. But John Robertson, I appreciate you taking time to sit down with us here, Rethinking a Dollar. Definitely look forward to following the current situation in Zimbabwe and staying in touch with you and whatnot. So other than that, I wish you the best this new year and hopefully the better in 2017. Is there any last minute thoughts you want to leave the audience with before we let you go?
Well, I do believe that people need to take very seriously the enormous impact you can get by respecting ownership rights and respecting the conditions that permit people to take their initiatives, people to be the promoters of business, and people to feel that having created something, they would not be in danger of having it taken from them. So this is why the property rights issue is important. It's not just a piece of land. It's the very concept that if you've built something, you should be allowed to say, this is mine and I can keep it, even if I have to pay taxes on it. Now, that's what's been damaged in this country. And so they've knocked the stuffing out of the initiative takers who might have made a difference. And the brightest of our people are leaving the country and starting businesses and new lives in other countries. And this is one of the most serious losses that we're facing today. We're encouraging the brightest of our young Zimbabweans to settle somewhere else.
Right.
And where they've settled, they are widely appreciated for their initiative and their work ethic. And we wish they were back here. This is where they are needed.
Yeah. Well, hey, yeah, definitely. If property rights is a big issue, that's something that was not really brought to my attention prior to listening to you. I imagine that if it can happen in Zimbabwe, it can happen in Venezuela, it can happen in Nigeria. It's definitely something that can happen here in the United States down the line as well. So something worth thinking about. But so, John, thank you for sitting down. Look forward to staying in touch with you. I want you to have a good day and definitely have a good 2017, my friend.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'll be very happy to talk to you again anytime you've got the time.
Sounds good. Thank you.